The studio's toughest guy stopped talking, and everyone wondered who that face belonged to. Harrison Ford had been on The Tonight Show dozens of times. 50 years in Hollywood had taught him how to handle any interview, any question, any surprise Jimmy Fallon could throw at him. He'd faced aliens, Nazis, replicants, and every late-night host in America without breaking a sweat. But on this particular Tuesday night in November, something happened that no one in that studio, not even Ford himself, saw coming. The cameras were rolling. The audience was laughing. Jimmy had just asked Ford about his latest film, cracking one of his signature jokes about Ford's famously grumpy on-set demeanor. Ford smirked, started to answer, opened his mouth, and then he stopped. Mid-sentence. Mid-breath. His eyes locked onto someone in the audience. Row 12. Seat 7. Jimmy noticed first. The smile fell from his face. The cue cards in his hands dropped to the desk. Something was wrong. Something was very, very different. Harrison? Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. You okay? Ford didn't answer. He stood up slowly from the guest chair, his leather jacket creaking in the sudden silence. The Roots stopped playing. The audience murmur faded to nothing. 240 people held their breath as one of Hollywood's most iconic actors walked past Jimmy's desk, past the cameras, straight into the audience. Jimmy Fallon had hosted over 2,000 episodes. He'd never seen anything like this. And what happened next would break him in ways he never expected. Let's go back. Let's go back to how this night started, before everything changed. It was 4:47 p.m., 3 hours before showtime. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza buzzed with the usual pre-show energy. Producers ran through scripts, the Roots sound-checked, and audience coordinators lined up the night's guests outside. Among them, in the middle of a long queue of excited fans, stood an elderly woman. 83 years old. Thin gray hair. Wearing a faded denim jacket that had seen better decades. Her name was Dorothy Chen, though nobody in that line knew it yet. She'd flown in from Seattle. Alone. Used her social security check to buy the plane ticket. Slept on her niece's couch in Brooklyn for 2 nights just to be here. The ticket in her weathered hand was for tonight's taping. Harrison Ford was the guest, and Dorothy had a secret she'd carried for 61 years. Inside the studio, Harrison Ford arrived in his usual manner, 15 minutes late, coffee in hand, refusing small talk. He sat in the green room, scrolling through his phone, while producers briefed him on the segment rundown. Standard stuff, Harrison. New movie, funny story about the set, maybe something about Star Wars if you're feeling generous. Ford grunted. He'd done this dance 1,000 times. Meanwhile, Dorothy Chen was being seated. Row 12, seat 7. Perfect view of the stage. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat down. Not from age. From something else. From memory. From a promise she'd made in 1962 to a young carpenter in Los Angeles who told her he'd make it big someday. The show began at 7:35 p.m. sharp. Jimmy's monologue killed. The audience roared. The Roots played Ford's entrance music, that familiar Imperial March mixed with the Indiana Jones theme, and Harrison Ford walked out to thunderous applause. He sat down, shook Jimmy's hand with that signature Ford handshake, firm but brief, and the interview began. Harrison Ford, ladies and gentlemen. Jimmy beamed. Man, you look great. Seriously, what's your secret? You're 81 and you still look like you could punch a Nazi. Ford deadpan. I do punch Nazis. Daily. It's my cardio. The audience erupted. Jimmy slapped the desk, laughing that genuine Fallon laugh that made him America's favorite host. This was going perfectly. This was classic Ford. Grumpy, funny, charming in his own reluctant way. So the new film, Jimmy continued, glancing at his notes. You play a retired pilot who? That's when it happened. Ford's eyes drifted. Just for a second. Past Jimmy. Past the cameras. Into the audience. Row 12. His sentence died in his throat. Jimmy noticed the shift immediately. The veteran host's smile flickered. "Harrison? You good, man?" Ford didn't respond. He was staring. Actually staring. Not the actor's calculated pause. Not the comedic timing. Real, genuine shock frozen on his face. The studio fell into confused silence. The Roots exchanged glances. Questlove raised an eyebrow. The audience murmured. Something was happening, something unscripted, something real. And then Harrison Ford stood up. He walked past Jimmy's desk. Past the camera operators who scrambled to follow him. Past the producers frantically whispering into headsets. He walked straight into the audience, up the stairs, toward row 12. Toward Dorothy Chen. Jimmy Fallon stood up from his desk. His hands shook slightly. In 12 years of hosting The Tonight Show, through every surprise guest, every prank, every musical number gone wrong, he never lost control of his show. But he wasn't in control anymore. Nobody was. Ford stopped at row 12. The cameras zoomed in, struggling to capture what was happening. Dorothy Chen, this tiny elderly woman in a faded denim jacket, looked up at Harrison Ford with tears streaming down her face. "Dottie?" Ford's voice cracked. 70 million people watching at home had never heard Harrison Ford's voice crack. "Dottie Chen?" She nodded. Couldn't speak. Just nodded. Ford knelt down in the aisle. This 81-year-old movie star, this man who'd spent 50 years playing heroes, knelt in front of an elderly woman nobody in that audience knew, and he started to cry. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Jimmy Fallon didn't know what to do. His producers were screaming in his earpiece. "Get control! Go to commercial! Do something!" But Jimmy couldn't move. He stood behind his desk, watching Harrison Ford kneel in front of a stranger, and something in his chest tightened. "I thought you were gone," Ford whispered, loud enough for the boom mic to catch. "I looked for you. For years. I thought you were gone." Dorothy reached out with a shaking hand and touched Ford's face. "I promised I'd come see you when you made it big. Took me a while, but I keep my promises." The audience didn't know whether to applaud, to stay silent, to cry. Many did all three. Jimmy walked out from behind his desk. Slowly. Cameras followed him as he approached the audience, approached Ford and Dorothy, and for the first time in his career, Jimmy Fallon had no joke, no bit, no funny voice to lighten the moment. "Harrison," Jimmy said softly. "Who is this?" Ford stood up, helping Dorothy to her feet. He looked at Jimmy, then at the cameras, then at the 240 people in that studio who'd come for laughs and were getting something else entirely. "This," Ford said, his voice still thick with emotion, "is the woman who saved my life." The story came out slowly, in fragments, as Ford helped Dorothy down to the stage. Jimmy guided them both to the couch, abandoning his desk entirely. The Roots stayed silent. The producers stopped yelling in earpieces. This wasn't a show anymore. This was something else. Behind the scenes, Fallon had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Let it happen. Let the story unfold. Let the world see this. In 1962, Harrison Ford was nobody. A 20-year-old carpenter in Los Angeles, trying to break into acting, failing audition after audition. He was broke, depressed, sleeping in his car most nights. One winter evening, parked outside a diner on Sunset Boulevard, he decided he was done. Done with Hollywood. Done with rejection. Done with everything. He wrote a note. Put it on the dashboard. Started the engine in that closed garage behind the diner. Dorothy Chen, a waitress at that diner, was taking out trash when she heard the engine running. She found him. Broke the window. Dragged him out. Sat with him on the curb until the ambulance came, until the police took the note, until Ford's friend picked him up. Before he left, Ford had grabbed her hand. If I ever actually make it in this town, I'm going to find you and thank you." Dorothy smiled through her tears. "Just make it, kid. That's thanks enough. Ford never saw her again. Searched for years. The diner closed. Dorothy had moved. No social media in those days. No way to track someone down who didn't want to be found. 61 years later, Dorothy Chen sat on the Tonight Show couch next to Harrison Ford and told her side of the story. "I didn't save you for fame," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I saved you because I saw myself in that car. 10 years earlier, different city, same despair. Someone saved me. So I saved you." Jimmy Fallon couldn't hold it together anymore. The cameras caught it. The tears streaming down his face. The way his hands shook as he pulled a tissue from the box on his desk. This wasn't the funny Jimmy. This wasn't the guy who did bits with puppets and played egg Russian roulette. This was just a man, devastated by the weight of human kindness. "Dorothy," Jimmy managed. "Why now? Why come now after all these years?" She smiled. A small, tired smile. "Because I'm dying, sweetheart." Stage 4. Maybe 6 months. And I made a promise to a kid in 1962. Figured I'd better keep it while I still can. The studio broke. Not polite applause. Not orchestrated emotion. Real, raw, collective grief and joy tangled together. The audience stood. The Roots stood. Questlove wiped his eyes with a drumstick. Jimmy walked over to Dorothy and Harrison, and he did something he'd never done in 2,000 episodes. He took off his tie. It was a Tonight Show tradition. The tie, the blazer, the desk. The armor of the host. Jimmy nodded his signature tie, the one his wardrobe team had picked for tonight's show, and he handed it to Dorothy. "This," Jimmy said, his voice breaking completely, "this is for you. For every life you've saved. For every kid who needed someone to break the window." Dorothy took the tie. Held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Ford wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and the three of them sat there, on national television, in front of millions of people, and they just were. No jokes. No bits. Just three human beings in a moment too big for scripting. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Harrison Ford reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out something small. A piece of paper, folded dozens of times, edges worn soft from years of handling. He unfolded it carefully. It was the note. The suicide note from 1962. The one the police had returned to him years later when he'd gotten sober, when he'd started therapy, when he'd finally processed what had almost happened that night. He'd carried it ever since. A reminder. Of how close he'd come. Of who saved him. Ford handed the note to Dorothy. "I've carried this for 61 years. I think it belongs to you now." Dorothy read it. Her lips moved silently. When she finished, she folded it back up, pressed it to her heart, and looked at Ford with the kind of love that transcends time. "You made it, kid," she whispered. "You really made it." Jimmy couldn't host anymore. He sat on the floor next to the couch. Just sat there. Tears flowing freely. His producers had given up trying to control the show. This was beyond television now. This was life, unfiltered, happening in real time. The audience didn't know whether to leave or stay. Nobody wanted to break the moment. Nobody wanted it to end. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only 8 minutes, Jimmy stood up. He looked at the camera. Looked directly into the lens with red, swollen eyes. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I've hosted this show for 12 years. I've interviewed presidents, musicians, actors, astronauts. I've never felt this." He turned to Dorothy. "Thank you. Thank you for being the kind of person who breaks windows. Thank you for saving him. Thank you for saving all of us who needed to see this tonight." Dorothy nodded. Smiled. That same small smile. The show didn't go to commercial. Didn't continue with planned segments. Jimmy made another decision, the kind that gets hosts fired. He ended the show right there. Thank the audience. Thank the Roots. Walk Dorothy and Harrison backstage personally. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. What happened after the cameras stopped is the part that matters most. Jimmy Fallon sat in his dressing room for 2 hours. Didn't change clothes. Didn't take calls. Just sat there, holding that moment, processing what he'd witnessed. His wife came to the studio, held him while he cried properly, the kind of crying that comes from confronting your own fragility. Harrison Ford stayed with Dorothy. They talked until midnight in the green room. About life. About death. About the kids Ford might have never had if Dorothy hadn't broken that window. About the grandkids Dorothy got to meet because someone broke her window 40 years before Ford's attempt. Dorothy flew back to Seattle the next morning. Ford paid for first class. Set up a fund to cover her medical expenses for however long she had left. Visited her twice before she passed, for months later, in a hospice surrounded by family. At her funeral, Harrison Ford gave the eulogy. Brought the note, now laminated, now a permanent part of his life. Read it aloud to the 100 people gathered. Told them all what Dorothy had taught him, that saving one life can change everything. Jimmy Fallon never wore a tie on The Tonight Show again. When asked why, he simply said, "I gave it to someone who deserved it more." The tie hangs in Dorothy Chen's family home in Seattle. Next to it, a photo from that night, Jimmy, Harrison, and Dorothy on the couch. 3 strangers who became family in 8 minutes. Ford still carries the note. Jimmy still thinks about that night. And somewhere, Dorothy's promise lives on in the millions who watched a window get broken on live television, who saw what happens when someone refuses to look away from pain. That's the legacy. Not the movies. Not the jokes. Not the fame. Just one woman, one night, one choice to break the glass and pull someone back from the edge. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop the show and remember we're all just people trying to make it through.